Hello guys, it's Jonathan here doing another Bakugan discussion. Today I want to talk about 36mm Bakugan. So during BakuTech Gachi, we got a lot of 36mm Bakugan. They were kind of the main Bakugan of the line. And these Bakugan are known for being very, very good. If you look at my tier list, S and S plus tier have 8 of these Bakugan on there of 10 slots, so they're pretty dominant. But for this video, I want to have a hypothetical of what if every Bakugan in BakuTech was a 32mm Bakugan? Would these Bakugan still actually hold up? I think it's obvious that being 36mm is an advantage, but how big of an advantage is it? Does it hard carry these Bakugan, or is it just a slight trait that gives them a bit of a boost over others, but wouldn't actually help that much? So I'm going to go ahead and go through the 15 basic 36mm Bakugan to try and answer that question. So I'm going to go in what in my opinion is the worst to best. So starting off with Tornado. Tornado is a big Bakugan, has kind of this deflection thing going on. Would this Bakugan actually be better if it was 32mm? In my opinion, not really. I think it just stays the same. It'd just be a solid, bulky Bakugan similar to things like Dagger Otis. Probably just has a slight edge on them because, well, it can spin, but beyond that, I don't really think this Bakugan is much better or worse, regardless of its size. Yes, on a technical level, it is better, but we've already established that there is kind of a base boost to being 36mm, but again, in this hypothetical, if everything's 32mm, well, then yeah, it's just kind of on a level playing field, about the same as it already is. Lashao Falco also really isn't that great, and I think that's kind of just reflected if it was 32mm. It's an okay attacker with solid control. That remains consistent. I think it might be slightly worse because there's plenty of other Bakugan like that that also just have more metal, so it's probably even less relevant than it already is. But I don't really think it being 36mm is doing a whole lot for it. It's still not a phenomenal Bakugan, it's just decent as is, so not really much else to say about this one, honestly. Gigahorace is kind of in a similar situation, I feel. It's a good attacker, and even though the metal parts are small, having 6 definitely would help it to maintain being at least a solid attacker. You also have some curve shot potential with how they move, at least a little bit. I do think it being smaller would make it a bit worse. It'd probably hover closer to B tier instead of A tier, but I don't think it being 36mm absolutely carries it again. I feel like for some of these that are lower on the tier list, well, not really that low, but for 36mm standards, they're low. They aren't actually that much different if you size them down. Again, they're just kind of a bit worse, and yeah, this is the case here as well, I think. Ogre Leonis, I think, would probably be literally the exact same. It's a solid attacker as is, but it has a good amount of bulk and occupancy for that rule as well. And if everything is smaller, well, then this thing is kind of the same way. Although losing out on some of its bulk would probably hurt it, because right now the size does cover a pretty good amount of the card, and if you lose that, it's definitely going to be smaller, and there are still Bakugan like Daifujo and Acro Desert that are 32mm and do cover quite a bit of the card. I still think for its role it would do a solid job, but it'd definitely take a hit because it wouldn't be quite as heavy with just the 2 metal pieces, I think. But it still would stay probably around the same position, maybe drops to B tier, but it's probably still a high B competing with some standard 4 metal piece Bakugan. Maybe even scrapes back into low A, but again, just a slight downgrade for this one overall. Made Last Boss, I think, also is similar. You get a slight downgrade because it's a bit lighter, but you still have the curve shot potential. The thing is definitely still an A tier, even as a 32mm Bakugan. But losing a bit of weight does make it a bit worse at attack, but you still have a really, really high amount of utility on this thing, so I don't particularly think it lowers much at all. Barrier Beyond is just as effective as it already is. This barrier might be a little bit less wide, maybe also a bit thinner, but it definitely still get the job done. It also means to be facing a less powerful Bakugan since you don't have some of the monsters that are 36mm attackers. So I think Barrier Beyond would be the exact same. Hell, it might even get slightly better not having to face as strong of attackers, but realistically it still probably would fall around the same position overall. Nino de Shao would be the exact same. I don't see this thing changing at all. Yes, you lose a little bit of size and maybe a slight amount of power, but the main part of this thing is that it just springs forward at a pretty extreme degree. Having a force to just kind of fly off the card of it that would be maintained as a 32mm Bakugan. It'd still be just as powerful. The strongest attacker in the game that is held back by a second magnet, that is all still true, so Nino de Shao is really just the exact same. However, we finally get to our first sort of fraud, and that is Yodan Shifor. Yodan Shifor wouldn't become like bad or anything, I mean it's still a good Bakugan, but I don't think this thing would be S tier at all. Its size would be far more comparable to things like Acro Gezard, which is still a very good Bakugan, but this thing also would have the utility of, double stands. Its other two moves I don't really think are great regardless, personally. I don't think they're worth using. I still think it's just mainly for occupancy and potentially double stands, but the double stand utility is there, but now it'd be lighter than Acro Gezard since that has, the two cross pieces. So this thing is just kind of an Acro Gezard that gets pushed around easier. The double stand utility would still make this thing A tier, and it still has the size of Acro Gezard, but Acro Gezard would be a much better Bakugan. And this thing would probably be a lower A tier Bakugan. It still has good occupancy with potential for double stand utility, but I think losing out on some of the size would actually hurt this thing considerably. So again, it's still a good Bakugan, but it definitely does have a lot of problems when you take away some of its size. Zeta Monicus is probably going to be around the same potential as it already is. Still can do curve shots. Might not be as good, would be a weaker attacker, probably around mid-tier, I would say, but it would still be a G-Power powerhouse, so it still fills its role just fine. Might be a bit weaker overall, but yeah, it's not actually hurt all that bad. Okay, now we're getting into some of the more interesting cases, because we have Go-Garyu. Go-Garyu is well known for being, for many people, the best attacker in the game. For me personally, I still have it at second, but it's borderline interchangeable with number one. Go-Garyu, I think, would just kind of fall in line with things like Kachiagel and Budagil, which would kind of be around the best attackers in the game. Go-Garyu's head spring is still very powerful, not Kachiagel strong, but still strong. And it definitely opens up to be much larger than Kachiagel, while also having pretty good weight with having, the 4 metal blades as well as the metal horn. It definitely loses out on some power, but it would still, again, be around the strength of those two. And with no 36mm Bakugan, I think those would probably be your best attackers, and Go-Garyu would be right there with them. Well, at least in terms of pop-up force, because then there's also attackers that, use weight. Speaking of, Sanzu Habo is my personal favorite attacker in BakuTech. This thing is a weird case. This thing is notably heavier than the Tavenals, which are already tied for being the second heaviest Bakugan in the game. If you size this thing down, it loses some bulk. It still does have 2 metal soul pieces, 3 metal cross pieces, 3 metal horns, but I think it's probably on par with maybe just very slightly heavier than the Tavenals as a 32mm Bakugan. So I think this would kind of tie in with those, kind of being like Go-Garyu, where it just fits in as a third Bakugan in that role. I think all 6 of these Bakugan would be great attackers, again, probably all top tier. I don't know if they're S+, probably S, but they'd still be great regardless. But yeah, it just kind of helps to level the playing field a bit, and not have this thing be as dominant, but it would still definitely be very, very good. Next is Jabufudo. This might honestly be the weirdest case in the entire video, because Jabufudo is the best pure defensive Bakugan in the entire game, no questions asked. Something I've talked about before is how with defense, you really do need occupancy to make defense work. If you're just staying on the card and doing a good job at that, but don't take up much of the card, what are you really doing? I guess you could say it could be good for G-Power battles, but there's other Bakugan that do that better, and you generally want more than just that. Unless it's like armor's level like Yashidagaru with free select, but that's different. Jabufudo doesn't have that. So if size is down, I actually think Jabufudo is going to struggle. I think it has just enough occupancy to actually make it work. It's not big by any means, but again, it's just enough to actually warrant its extreme defense. But if you size this thing down, even if it's just a bit smaller, I think it actually starts to struggle, and I think it'd still be like a B tier Bakugan because it does stay on the card really well. But I just think it has a lot more counterplay, which you can argue would be better for the game, but at the same time you still have occupancy monsters like Acro Gezard, Daifujo, Yodan Shifor, Nagadaja, Ozpress, so this thing might not actually be as good, and something like Barrier Beyond would probably just be a better defensive Bakugan at that point. So I think Jaiba actually does struggle. Well, yes, again, it stays on the card extremely well. I don't know how strong that ability is without enough occupancy to back it up. That said, the concept of Jaiba could still easily work as a 32mm Bakugan. You could just rework the design to actually function. Hell, you could just make it a bit bigger as is, might be a little bit thinner, but you could definitely extend it to make it larger, and with that, yes, including the gimmick would still make this thing an absolute menace, and for sure, like a top 5 Bakugan in the game. It's just if you keep the exact design, I think it struggles, but yeah, you could definitely make up for it. So again, it's a weird case because it depends on how you want to argue this one. Because it's the exact same design, just scaled down. It struggles, but the concept of a second magnet could easily still work. So the gimmick itself is certainly not just carried by being a 36mm Bakugan. Next is Nagadaja, which is just so giant, I'm just going to play it sideways. And that's the thing about Nagadaja, it's giant. While this thing would be harmed by being a 32mm Bakugan, it's still massive. It would still be longer than the card, vertically, and it'd still be fairly wide, I would say. It definitely does lose some width, but it could definitely still block off a card if you needed to block off a card. Again, it might be more comparable to other things like Acro Gizzard, but I still think it's a better Bakugan overall. It'd still be a top tier occupancy Bakugan, especially against 32mm Bakugan. Even 36mm attackers, they still struggle to knock this thing off of a card. And I think even downsizing it, if it's against 32mm Bakugan only, this thing's not going anywhere. This thing is a menace regardless of how big it is. Next is Ozpress. Ozpress is another giant Bakugan. This thing is just as good, if not actually better, as a 32mm Bakugan. Again, the size is comparable to something like Acro Gizzard at that point. It should have fairly similar dimensions, being a very similar style to it. But you also have the Armor Band, which I think is generally more effective against 32mm Bakugan, and I think that would hold true if this was one as well. But also, Ozpress, the way it opens up, this thing can, actually, kind of attack. And while defensive Bakugan are still going to be a problem for it, you don't really have the sheer size or even weight, at least not to the same extent as you would otherwise. So I think this thing actually becomes a better attacker while maintaining its defense occupancy prowess. I think this is the one case where this Bakugan genuinely might be better if everything was a 32mm Bakugan, which is very interesting to hear. Even if that's not the case, so this thing is still just as good as is, so yeah, it's not really being harmed at all. And finally, the best Bakugan in the game is, of course, Jigen Dragon, and this thing I actually think might struggle a little bit. So, Jigen Dragon is like a borderline top tier attacker as is, and part of that is definitely the extra size and weight you would get from being a 36mm Bakugan. Without that, I think this thing is still a high tier attacker, maybe bordering on very high tier attacker, but it definitely would still lose to Gogaryu, Sanzu Halbos, Tavanals, Kachiagil, Budagil. Honestly, it might lose to Maid Last Boss as well. You know, it might even struggle with things like Jigen, Retta, or Rise Dragon at that point, which is weird to think about, but it's very possible. Now, for defense and occupancy, I think it's just as good, if not maybe even a little better than it already is. I think it holds up very well, definitely a very high tier Bakugan for sure. Overall though, I think, including the G-Power stuff, it's probably low to mid top tier. It still would be a great Bakugan, but definitely less effective for offense. Still an option that you have for sure, could definitely use it whenever you need it, but definitely less reliable, probably heavier for defense or G-Power battles, I think. Still top tier Bakugan, still good, but I do think that it being a 32mm Bakugan would honestly lower it quite a bit. It's definitely not number one in the game anymore. Which is certainly weird to think about considering just how dominant I feel like it is as of right now. So with all of that said, are 36mm Bakugan overpowered? Are they game breaking? Well, to be completely honest, yeah, they are. I think that they are really, really good. The problem is that I don't necessarily think they're actually that much better. I think Gotchi just had a lot of great designs that just pushed BakuTech to new heights, and I think a lot of the Bakugan would still be top tier or high tier as is. The difference though is that that little extra boost they get from their size definitely does propel them to be a bit above the others, which is why a lot of the 32mm Bakugan cap out at being kind of A or sometimes B tier, with just a few exceptions making it to like A plus tier. Discounting armors, those are weird. See, I think the game would have been a lot healthier if these didn't exist, or I guess, or maybe a bit weaker even. But as is, yeah, they do give them just enough to really dominate top tier. I don't necessarily think 36mm are overpowered in the sense that they just designed them to be insane, though. They would have been just as insane as 32mm Bakugan, as I've been saying. It's definitely a weird split, though, and I think it's honestly an awkward video to make, but I did think it could make for an interesting topic of discussion. To just say that, no, these Bakugan aren't overpowered inherently from their designs. While they're very good, they aren't game-breaking, but it's really just that extra boost that causes that divide, and yeah, it does end up boiling down to the size that does make the difference, I think. So in a sense, it does come full circle, and yeah, 36mm Bakugan are kind of broken, but maybe not in the sense that everyone would think. It really just is that extra boost that makes the difference, which is honestly a little unfortunate. I would have really liked to see a metagame where everything is just 32mm, because I think a lot more things would be good, and a lot of things that are maybe like B tier would actually be a lot more viable, honestly. Would have been interesting to see, but I guess it is what it is. This is what we're stuck with, so that's all to say on the topic. Again, just thought it was kind of interesting to talk about, so anyways, thanks for watching, and bye-bye.